This is lecture 59D in the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018 series. It'll be the chapter on Indonesia in volume 3 on communism in East Asia. And this is a continuation of yesterday's lecture on capitalism and Bolshevism in Indonesia, part 2. We'll begin by taking a look at the Indonesian hero Tan Malaka, who was born in present-day Negara Padang Gedang, West Sumatra, of uncertain date, where as a child he studied religion in the elementary school. But in 1908 he was able to attend the Pki School, a state teacher's school at Fort de Kock, and at this school Malaka was instructed in Dutch. In 1913 he graduated and left his village to study at a teacher education school in the Netherlands. And after the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917, Malaka read Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and V.I. Lenin, and along the way he met Henk Sneevliet, founder of the ISDV, Indonesian Social Democratic Movement, that became the Communist Party of Indonesia, Pki. In December 1919, Malaka returned to Indonesia, to his village, to teach the children of tea plantation coolies at Senamba in East Sumatra. In January 1920, he began teaching the children Malay, and along the way he taught Marxism, Leninism, and via Sneevliet he contacted the ISDV in the Dutch East Indies, or Indonesia, and wrote articles for their press. One of his earliest works was called Land of Paupers. In it he describes the great differential in wealth between capitalists and workers. It was included in the Het Woord in March 1920 issue, which we talked about last time, and Malaka also wrote about the suffering of the coolies in the Sumatra Post. In the 1920 election, he was the ISDV candidate. Malaka chose Java Island as the starting point of his struggle for communism in Indonesia. He arrived in Batavia, that is Jakarta today, with the idea of establishing a school. In March 1921, Malaka arrived at Yogyakarta, Java, and stayed at a house belonging to Sutopo, a former leader of the Budi Utomo. In Java, it was normal, then and now, for a person to have just one name. Anyway, at Sutopo's home, he outlined a plan for grammar school. He participated in the SI 5th Congress, that stands for Sarakat Islam, and he met HOS Joko Rominoto, Agnes Salem, Darsono, and Sebaun there. The Congress passed a resolution banning double-party membership, and since Sebaun and Darsono were PKI members, this SI split into White SI, led by Joko Rominoto, and Red SI, led by Sebaun, based in Semarang. After the Congress, Malaka was asked by Sebaun to go to Semarang to join the PKI, and he did. Arriving in Semarang, he began to meet with Red SI members, and there on the 20th of June 1921, he explained to them his idea for a rival school to government schools, a rival school with many branches. Their school was named Sekolah Sarakat Islam, later named after him as Sekolah Tan Malaka, and opened classes at branch campuses in Bandung and Ternate on 21 June 1921. In May of 1925, the Executive Committee of the Comintern, in a full session, ordered communists in Indonesia to form a united anti-imperialist front with non-communist nationalist organizations. Others, led by Alamin and Musso, called for a revolution to overthrow the Dutch colonial government. And at a conference in Prambanan, Central Java, communist-controlled trades unions decided the revolution would start with a strike by railroad workers that would signal a general strike, and then a revolution would start. This would lead to the PKI replacing the colonial government. The plan was for the revolution to begin in Padang, Sumatra, but Dutch thugs attacked the PKI at the beginning of 1926. The regime ended the right of assembly and seized PKI members at will, effectively forcing the party deeper underground. Tan Malaka, the Comintern's agent for Southeast Asia and Australia, did not agree with the plot to begin with, but because he thought more base building was needed first. So the June 1926 date for the revolution had been postponed until 12 November when it kicked off in Jakarta, that is Batavia, Padang, Bantam, and Surabaya. In Batavia, or Jakarta, the revolt was crushed in 2 days, but it took weeks for the caps to secure the rest of the country. 13,000 people had been arrested, 4,500 imprisoned, 1,308 interned, and 823 sent for extermination at the concentration camp at Daegul, West New Guinea. Non-communist political activists were also targeted by the colonial butcher regime under the pretext of suppressing the communist rebellion. In December 1926, Malacca, Jamaluddin, Tamin, and Subakatwat went to Bangkok and reviewed the events of November. And then 6 months later, in June 1927, the PKI was outlawed by the colonial regime. Malacca and pals concluded their Bangkok meeting and established what they called the Parti Republik Indonesia, PARI. The party had small membership inside the country, but with the PKI underground, it was the only organization calling for immediate independence for Indonesia. Some of the party cadres were Adam Malik, Charles Sala, Muhammad Yamin, and Iwa Kusumentri. In August 1927, Malacca went back to the Philippines. Meanwhile, the Dutch wanted to expel Malacca to Daegul concentration camp instead. So the Dutch thugs easily arranged for their gringo fellow thugs to arrest him on 12 August 1927 for illegal entry. Dr. San Jose Ahmad helped him in the court, and Malacca accepted the verdict that he would be deported to Amoy, Xiamen, China. The police of the Gulangzu, or Gulangyu, International Settlement, notified of Tan Malacca's passage to Amoy, awaited for him in the harbor, but he managed to escape as the sympathetic captain and crew protected him, entrusting his safety to a ship inspector who took Tan Malacca to a guest house from where he made his way to Sinching village with his newly made acquaintances. In August 1929, Malacca met Alamin in Shanghai, where he was given the Comintern's latest instructions, namely beginning by sending him to Shanghai. Malacca then traveled to Shanghai at the end of 1929. In September 1932, the Japanese forces had attacked China, and Malacca went to India disguised as a Chinese Filipino and using an alias. In early October 1932, British officials from Singapore arrested him in Hong Kong, and he was detained for several months. He hoped to have a chance to argue his case in court under British law and possibly seek asylum in the United Kingdom, but after several months of interrogation and being moved between the European and the Chinese sections of the jail, it was decided that he would simply be exiled from Hong Kong without charges. He was then deported again to Amoy. Malacca escaped once again and traveled to Iway village in the south of China, and there he was treated with traditional Chinese medicine for his illness. In 1935, the PKI leader Musso returned from Moscow and led the work in the trade unions. In the Netherlands, the PKI started working among Indonesian students within the nationalist organization called Perhimpunan Indonesia. After his health improved in the beginning of 1936, Malacca traveled back to Amoy and formed the Foreign Language School. The port city was nominally under Chinese sovereignty, but was dominated first by European nations, with trading concessions in the city, and then by Japan after its September 1932 invasion. The oppression of the Chinese he saw there under both of these powers contributed to his uncompromising position against collaboration with the Japanese or negotiation with the Dutch in the 1940s. In August 1937, he went to Singapore under a fake Chinese identity and became a teacher. After the Dutch surrendered to Japan, he returned to Indonesia via Penang, and he then sailed to Sumatra, arriving in Jakarta in mid-1942, where he wrote Matilog. After he felt he had to have a job, he applied to the Social Welfare Agency and was soon sent to a coal mine in Baya on the southern coast of western Java. During the war years, the Japanese spread the word that they were the light of Asia. Japan was the only Asian nation that had successfully transformed itself into a modern technological society. It had remained independent when its neighbors had been under European or U.S. colonizers, and it had beaten Russia in the 1904 war. Following its military campaign in China, Japan turned its attention to Southeast Asia, advocating what they called a Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. In that pitch, the Japs described their co-prosperity sphere as a trade zone under their leadership. The Japanese had gradually spread their influence through Asia in the first half of the 20th century, and during the 1920s and 1930s, they had established business links in the Dutch Indies. These ranged from small-town barbers, photographic studios, and salesmen to large department stores and firms such as Suzuki and Mitsubishi becoming involved in the sugar trade. The Japanese population peaked in 1931 with 6,949 residents before starting a gradual decrease, largely due to economic tensions between Japan and the Netherlands Indies government. A number of Japanese had been sent by their government to establish links with Indonesian nationalists, particularly with the Muslim parties, while Indonesian nationalists were sponsored to visit Japan. Such encouragement of Indonesian nationalism was part of a broader Japanese plan for an Asia for the Asians. While most Indonesians were hopeful for the Japanese promise of an end to Dutch racially based systems, Chinese Indonesians, who enjoyed a privileged position under Dutch rule, were less optimistic. Also concerned were members of the Indonesian Communist Underground, who followed the Soviet Union's Popular United Front against fascism. In November 1941, Majelis Rakyat Indonesia, an Indonesian organization of religious, political, and trade union groups, submitted a memorandum to the Dutch East Indies government requesting the mobilization of the Indonesian people in the face of war threat. The memorandum was refused because the government there did not consider the Majelis Rakyat Indonesia to be representative of the people. Within only a few months, the Japanese had occupied the entire archipelago. On December 8, 1941, the Netherlands declared war on Japan, and in January 42, the U.S., British, Dutch, Australian Command, ABDICOM, was formed to coordinate Allied forces in Southeast Asia under the command of General Archibald Wavell. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, senior Dutch government officials went into exile, taking political prisoners, family, and personal staff to Australia. Before the arrival of Japanese troops, there were conflicts between the Indonesian groups where people were killed, vanished, or went into hiding. Chinese and Dutch-owned properties were ransacked and destroyed. In January of 42, parts of Sulawesi and Kalimantan were under Japanese control. By February, the Japanese had landed on Sumatra, where they had encouraged the Akanese to rebel against the Dutch. And on 19th of February that year, having already taken Ambon, the Japanese Eastern Task Force landed in Timor. It dropped a special parachute battalion into West Timor near Kupang, while landing in the Dailai area of Portuguese Timor to expel the Allied forces that had invaded in December. On the 27th of February that year, 1942, the Allied Navy's last effort to contain Japan was swept aside by their defeat in the Battle of the Java Sea from 28 February to 1 March 1942. Japanese troops landed unopposed on 4 places along the northern coast of Java. The only fighting had been where there were Dutch troops at the invasion points in Ambon, Timor, Kalimantan, and on the Java Sea. On 9 March 1942, the Dutch commander surrendered along with Governor General Jaker AWL Jarda van Starkenhauer. Indonesians who came to meet the Japanese army waving flags and shouting support such as "Japan is our older brother" and "Banzai Dai Nippon" greeted the Japanese occupation with enthusiasm. As the Japanese advanced, rebellious Indonesians in virtually every part of the archipelago killed groups of Dutch Europeans and kept the Japanese reliably informed of the whereabouts of others. As famed Indonesian writer Amanta Toer wrote, with the arrival of the Japanese, just about everyone was full of hope, except for those who had worked in the service of the Dutch. Europeans in the colonial army, above which there were about 80,000, were sent to detention camps and 25,000 died. Indonesian soldiers were sent home. Expecting that Dutch administrator would be kept by the Japanese to run the colony, 100,000 Dutch had not left and ended up in concentration camps where 30,000 died. Japanese and Indonesian replacements were installed in senior and technical positions, and Japanese troops took control of government infrastructure and services such as ports and postal services. During World War II, the economy of Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, as it had been, crumbled away. Japan redirected every resource for its war effort, and accordingly food, clothing, and medicine were scarce, and less fortunate regions suffered famine. In 1944-1945, Allied troops largely bypassed Indonesia and did not fight their way into populous Java and Sumatra. Therefore, most of Indonesia was still under Japanese occupation at the time of Japan's surrender in August 1945. This occupation had been the first serious challenge to the Dutch in Indonesia. It had ended Dutch colonial rule, made the Indonesian national revolution not just possible, but necessary. The Japanese had facilitated the politicization of Indonesians down to the village level, and in Java and Sumatra, the Japanese educated, trained, and armed many young Indonesians and gave their nationalist leaders a political voice. Thus, through both the destruction of the Dutch colonial regime and the facilitation of Indonesian nationalism, the Japanese occupation created new conditions. Indonesia was ripe for claiming independence within days of the Japanese surrender in the Pacific. However, the Netherlands, like France, sought to reclaim its East Asia colonies. Thus, the Dutch caps reinvaded Indonesia. War against the Red-led resistance lasted for 5 years. The Netherlands recognized Indonesian sovereignty in December 1949, not long before the Vietnamese defeated France at Dien Bien Phu, expelling them from all of Indochina. Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta, founding president and VP of the new Indonesian Republic, after Japan's surrender, had foreseen the Pacific War, and they had figured that a Japanese advance into Indonesia would go down as it had and might be advantageous for their independence cause. Japanese aggression in Manchuria and China in the late 1930s caused anxiety among the Chinese in Indonesia, who set up funds to support the anti-Japanese effort, and Dutch intelligence services also monitored Japanese living in Indonesia. The Indonesian ruling class, composed of local officials and politicians who had formerly worked for the Dutch colonial government, cooperated with the Japanese military authorities. They, in turn, helped keep the local political elites in power and employed them to supply newly arrived Japanese industrial concerns and businesses with labor. Indonesians were employed in police and in the armed forces run by the Jap Army, and Indonesian cooperation allowed the Japanese military government to focus on securing the large archipelago's waterways and skies and using its islands as defensive outposts against any Allied attacks, which they then assumed were most likely to come from Australia. They were wrong about that, but at any rate, those attacks came, as you know, from the U.S. Navy, working island hopping through the South Pacific. The Japanese colonial rulers divided Indonesia into separate regions. Sumatra was placed under the 25th Army. Java and Madura were under the 16th Army. Borneo and eastern Indonesia were controlled by the 2nd South Fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, and the 16th Army and the 25th Army were headquartered in Singapore and also controlled Malaya until April 43, when that command was narrowed to just Sumatra and the headquarters moved to Bukittinggi. The 16th Army was headquartered in Jakarta, while the IJN's 2nd South Fleet was then headquartered in Makassar. Experience of the occupation varied considerably depending upon where one lived and one's social position. Lower-class people who lived in areas considered important to the war effort experienced torture, sex slavery, arbitrary arrest, execution, and other war crimes. Many thousands of people were taken away from Indonesia as forced laborers, called Romusha, for Japanese military projects, including the Burma-Siam and Saiketi Baya railways, and suffered or died as a result of ill treatment and starvation. Between 4 and 10 million Romusha in Java were forced to work by the Japanese military. About 270,000 of these Javanese laborers were sent to other Japanese-held areas in Southeast Asia, and only 52,000 were repatriated to Java, and their death rate was about 80%. Tens of thousands of Indonesians were to starve, work as slave laborers, or be forced from their homes. In the national revolution that followed, tens, even hundreds of thousands would die in fighting against the Japanese, Allied forces, and other Indonesians before independence was achieved. A later United Nations report stated that Indonesians before independence, that 4 million people died in Indonesia as a result of famine and forced labor during the Japanese occupation, including 30,000 European civilian internee deaths. A Dutch government study describes how the Japanese military forced women into prostitution to serve their forces in Indonesia, and it concluded that among the 200 to 300 European women working in the Japanese military brothels, some 65 were most certainly forced into prostitution. Others faced with starvation in the refugee camps agreed to work for food, but the nature of that work was not revealed to them. Entire railways, including rolling stock and industrial plants in Java, were stolen and shipped to Japan and Jap-occupied Manchuria. Now, with regard to the opposition, in February and November of 42, the Islamic clerics organization called Akhanese Ulama fought against both the Dutch and the Japanese. They revolted against the Dutch in February and against Japan in November of 42. The All-Aceh Religious Scholars Association, PUSA, led the revolt. The Japanese suffered 18 dead in the uprising, while they slaughtered over 120 Akhanese. The revolt happened in Bayou and was centered around Jot Pilang's village religious school. During the revolt, the Japanese troops armed with mortars and machine guns were fought by sword-wielding Akhanese under Tegungu Abdul Jalil in Bulo, Kampong, Tenagung, Jot Pilang on the 10th and 13th of November of 1942. Next to Sultan Zajahir, who led the student or Pemuda underground, the only prominent opposition politician was leftist Emir Jarafuddin. Jarafuddin was given 25,000 guilders by anti-fascist Dutch in early 1942. He was to organize an underground resistance through his Marxist and nationalist connections. The Japanese arrested Emir in 1943, and he only escaped execution following intervention from Sukarno, whose popularity in Indonesia, and hence with the Japanese, who recognized his importance to their war effort, saved him. Apart from Emir Jarafuddin's Surabaya-based group, the most active pro-Allied activities were among the Chinese, Ambonese, and Manadonese. In South Kalimantan, a scheme by Indonesian nationalists and anti-fascist Dutch against the Japanese was uncovered before the Pontianak incident occurred. According to some sources, this happened in September 43 at Amuntai in South Kalimantan and involved establishing an Islamic state and expelling the Japanese, but the plan was defeated. In 1943, the Japanese beheaded Tengku Rahmatullah, a member of the royal family of the Sultanate of Serdang. In the 1943-1944 Pontianak massacre, the Japanese orchestrated a mass arrest. Victims were the elites of Malay and Arabia, along with foreigners of Chinese, Javanese, Mandonese, Dayak, Bugis, Batak, Minangkabau, Dutch, Indian, and Eurasian origin in Kalimantan. This included all of the Malay sultans. Formality was the accusation of plotting to overthrow Japanese rule. All were murdered. Along the way, the Japanese charged all ethnic groups and organizations, such as the Islamic Pemuda Muhammadiyah, in a plot to overthrow Jap rule and create a People's Republic of West Borneo. The Sultan of the Pontianak Sultanate was charged with being one of the ringleaders in the planned rebellion. Up to 25 aristocrats, relatives of the Sultan of Pontianak, and many other leading people were named as participants in the plot, and they were all executed at the Mandor capital of Sulawesi. In Java, the Japanese jailed Syarif Abdul Hamid al-Qadri, the son of Sultan Syarif Muhammad al-Qadri. Since he was in Java during the executions, Hamid II was the only male in his family not killed, while the Japanese beheaded all 28 other male relatives of Pontianak Sultan Muhammad al-Qadri. Among the 29 people of the Sultan of Pontianak's family who were beheaded by the Japanese was the heir to the Pontianak throne. In 1944, the Dayaks assassinated a Japanese man named Nakatani, who had been involved in the Pontianak massacre and who had distinguished himself in his cruelty. The Japanese had beheaded both Pangeran Adipati and Pangeran Agung in a public execution. The Japanese extermination of the Malay elite of Pontianak paved the way for a new Dayak elite to rise in its place. So, in May through August of 1945, Japanese invaders were killed in a rebellion by the Dayaks in Sangao called the Mejang Desa War. The Chinese community was most heavily impacted in Kalimantan. In May of 1945, the Akadesi rebelled again. Now, with regard to Indonesian nationalism, in the decades before the war, the Dutch had been overwhelmingly successful in suppressing the small nationalist movement in Indonesia. Accordingly, the Japanese invasion was helpful in the fight for Indonesian independence. During their occupation, the Japanese encouraged and backed Indonesian nationalistic sentiments, created new Indonesian institutions, and promoted nationalist leaders such as Sukarno. The openness now provided to Indonesian nationalism, combined with the Japanese destruction of much of the Dutch colonial regime, was positive for the Indonesian national revolution that followed World War II. Nonetheless, within 2 months of the occupation, the Japanese did not allow the political use of the word Indonesia as the name for a nation. Neither did they allow the use of the nationalistic red and white Indonesian flag. In fact, any discussion, organization, speculation, or propaganda concerning the political organization or government of the country, also in the media, was strictly forbidden. They divided the Dutch East Indies into 3 separate regions, and they now referred to this former Dutch colony as their southern territories. Therefore, while Tokyo prepared the Philippines for independence in 1943, they had simultaneously decided to annex the Indonesian islands into their greater Japanese empire. Until late 1944, when their Pacific War was clearly lost, the Japanese never seriously supported Indonesian independence. In Java, the Japanese regime saw Indonesia's most politically sophisticated population. However, its natural resources were economically its least important asset. Javanese people, on the other hand, were considered Japan's main economic resource, and in contrast to Dutch exploitation, the Japanese encouraged Indonesian nationalism in Java. In Sumatra, encouragement of nationalism and natural resources came after it was clear the Japanese would lose the war. However, the outer islands were under naval control and economically vital for the Japanese war effort, and suffered the usual human atrocities characterized by Jap fascism. On 16 April 1943, to gain support among the Indonesian people for their war effort, the Japanese occupation forces encouraged the Indonesian nationalist movement. They allowed recruiting by Indonesian nationalist leaders including Sukarno, Hatta, Kai Hajar Dewantara, and Kaya Haji Mas Mansyur. A rising was the mobilization center Pusat Tenaga Rakyat. On March 1, 1944, Pusat Tenaga Rakyat was replaced with Jawa Hokakai. Thus mobilized, these people were drafted into forced labor as Romusha. The end of the occupation. As the entire world knows, MacArthur's pledge to return and liberate the Philippines had been total bullshit. Neither the Pentagon nor FDR were about to let that clown get his hands on anything military again. So it was that Indonesia also fought its battle against the Japs on its own. The Japanese occupation of Indonesia officially ended with Japanese surrender in the Pacific. 2 days later, Sukarno declared Indonesian independence, and now Indonesian patriotic forces would spend the next 4 years fighting the Dutch for independence. A later UN report stated that 4 million people died in Indonesia because of the Japanese occupation. About 2.4 million of them starved to death in Java from 44 to 45. Liberation of the internment camps holding Western prisoners was not swift. Conditions were better during post-war internment than under previous internment, for this time Red Cross supplies were made available, and the Allies made the Japanese order the most heinous and cruel occupiers home. After 4 months of post-war internment, Western internees were released on the condition they left Indonesia. Most of the Japanese military personnel and civilian colonial administrators were repatriated to Japan following the war, although the process took nearly a year for most individuals and often 2 years or more. Following screening for war crimes, physical labor or security duty for thousands more, and war crimes trials for 1,038 individuals. They were sent back to Japan aboard remaining Japanese vessels, and approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers deserted from their units, then under Allied command, and assimilated themselves into local communities. Many of them joined the TNI or other Indonesian military organizations, and several of the former Japanese soldiers died during the Indonesian National Revolution, including the famous Abdul Rahman, or Japanese Ichiki Tatsuo. On the 3rd of October 45, the Japanese tried to re-establish the authority they relinquished to Indonesians in the towns and cities. Japanese military police killed Republican Pemuda in Pekalongan, Central Java, and drove Republican Pemuda out of Bandung in West Java before handing the city to the British. On the 14th of October 45, the Japs kicked off fierce fighting in Semarang against Republican forces before the Brits could arrive. 500 Japanese and 2,000 Indonesians had been killed by the Japanese before the British forces arrived. In April of 46, Mountbatten said after visiting Sumatra that he knew that we had been forced to keep Japanese troops under arms to protect our lines of communication in vital areas. Nevertheless, it was a great shock to me to find over 1,000 Japanese troops guarding the 9 miles of road from the airport to the town. By 1949, the Dutch caps were back in the saddle, and they held 448 war crimes trials against 1,038 war criminals, of whom 969 were convicted, with 236 receiving the death sentence. Now, as for the Pki fight in the Netherlands. In 1945, the Pki, the Communist Party of Indonesia, re-emerged on the political scene after the Japanese surrender. It led the struggle for independence from the Netherlands with its own armed units. And although these Pki militias played the essential role in fighting against the Dutch, President Sukarno realized the growing influence of the Pki would eventually threaten his position. Of course, the growth of the Pki worried the right wing of the Indonesian polity, not to mention Gringolandia. Thus, the relationship between the Pki and the Caps was doomed to collapse into conflict. In February 1948, the Pki and the Socialist Party, Partij Socialis, formed a joint People's Democratic Front. But that front did not last long. Worldwide, the Truman Gang was preparing its war against the USSR and would not tolerate any unity but the one they imposed. Then the Socialist Party merged with the Pki and the entire matter became academic. On the 11th of August 1948, Musso returned to Jakarta after 12 years in the USSR. The PKI Politburo reconstructed included Daipa, Nusantara Edit, M.H. Lukman, and Njoto. On the 17th of January 48, a treaty between the Netherlands and the Republic of Indonesia was concluded on the U.S. warship Renville, anchored in Jakarta Harbor. It replaced the failed Dutch-Indonesian Lingajati Agreement of 46. Afterwards, many of the Republican armed units returned from zones of conflict. This gave the Indonesian right wing some confidence that they would be able to counter the PKI militarily when its guerrilla units and militias were ordered to disband. On the 18th of September of 1948, that same year, in Madiun, a city in the western part of East Java, a group of PKI militia soldiers refused to go along with the disarmament and were murdered by gringo thugs. The killing sparked a violent uprising, which is what the CIA wanted in order to provide a pretext. A pretext for what? For the government to clamp down on the PKI with the false flag that the PKI had announced the proclamation of the Soviet Republic of Indonesia. The elaborated fairy tale was one of the CIA's earliest, and Musso, as the Soviet Republic's president, and Amar Sajarfuddin, as its prime minister, played leading roles. At the same time, the PKI had denounced the uprising and appealed for calm, and eventually the uprising was suppressed by Republican troops. On the 30th of September that year, 1948, Madiun was taken over by Republican troops of the Siliwangi Division, and thousands of PKI cadre were killed, and 36,000 were imprisoned and or executed. On 31 October 1948, Musso was murdered while, quote, attempting to escape from prison, unquote. Edit and Lukman went into exile in the People's Republic of China, and the reconstruction of the PKI began in 1949. And that brings us to a conclusion of the second part of our discussion of capitalism and Bolshevism in Indochina. And we'll continue with the third part in the next lecture.